Hey guys, this is Science for 7th and 8th, and today's lesson is for May 4th. May 4th, and we're going to read through pages 439 through 442. Of course, today is the day that you are picking up some work, so just to give you an idea of what your week is like, I sent home a quiz for 12.1, which is the first section of chapter 12. I sent home an activity sheet for 12A. I also sent home two more quizzes, a quiz for 12.2 and a quiz for 12.4. After this week, next week, we only have one small section of a chapter to finish in the forestry chapter, or dendrology if you want to be scientific. And I'm sending home next Monday, your last Monday to get work on May 11th, I'm sending home activity sheet 12B as well as the test for chapter 12. And then technically, you're done for science. So it's getting super, super close to when you're going to be finished, right? So let's get started on page 439. We're going from 439 through 442. And we're got some wood. I don't remember I told you in our last lesson to go out and get you some wood. This is some, I did not get this, but I have a husband that loves to do woodworking. Yeah, could be used as a weight. And we're mainly going to look at this branch, and we're going to look at that. Yeah. I think this is a branch. I don't think this was a trunk. I'm pretty sure this was a branch that he cut off of something. I think it's a sycamore tree, but we'll look at it. Before we get into today's lesson, let's go ahead and go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we praise you and we love you for the many blessings you've given us, especially creation for trees that provide us not only beauty and shade, but also that oxygen that we need to breathe. And there's just so many things that you give us that we don't even know that we need, but you've already provided for us. And we especially thank you for salvation through the sacrifice of your Son. And Father, as you forgive us, help us to be willing and to forgive others who may just do mean, stinky stuff to us. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, guys, so we're on page 439. We are going, the main branch of that tree, the main branch, was a trunk. And a tree trunk basically consists of several basic layers. So I have a sycamore tree. Now he has, since I said he does woodworking, he was going to make this, I think it was supposed to be a table leg, but it's kind of a little too crooked. And this was going to be a really rustic table. You can kind of see he's cut off some branches and stuff. And if this was nope, that's a little part that's been cut out. If this was a sycamore out in the woods, sycamores have really pilly bark. You can really start, that's one way you can notice. You can start peeling it. He's obviously smoothed this down a little bit. Like I said, this is the first thing I could get a hold of. So, a tree trunk consists of several layers. And if you look on the side, if you've got a stem, I'm going to kill myself with this thing. If you look at the stem, yeah, maybe that's a better view. If you look at it, the bark, it consists of several layers. You've got the outside, that's the bark. Then you go into the inner side, that's the cambium. You have the wood, and then you have the pith that, as you go in. Bark is that rough covering that's on the outside of the tree. And for a lot of dendrologists and people who identify trees, since the leaves aren't on deciduous trees all year round, most of us can pick out, okay, that's a cedar tree, or just from the smell or from the look at it. But for deciduous trees, since their leaves aren't on them, most dendrologists identify it by the bark. They can simply look at it. Now, I'm not a tree person. My husband very much is so. And he can pretty well, from his training that he got in college, he can pretty well identify a lot of trees, which is pretty important if you're trying to look for different wildlife and things like that. So the bark is the rough covering, and the bark is divided into two regions, outer and inner bark. I'm sure there's more scientific names for that, but that's what they've told us. The dead outer bark is designed to protect the tree from injury I've got bark all over my books, from attacks by animals, fungi, and fire. And guys, probably the easiest place I can tell you that you all might have driven through that has experienced a forest fire recently, and I just remember the fire happened in November, and I was there for a marathon in April, May, and you could barely tell there had been a fire, and that was Gatlinburg. Remember, if you're driving through Gatlinburg? So why were all those trees? You could see some dead stuff, but a lot of trees were still standing, but you could see scars of fire. And it's because the fire came through and it burned that outer layer, that outer dead layer of fire. Fungi can get on here. You know, you can have some lichens, you can have some moss. It's not that big of a deal to the tree. Routinely, animals eat bark. Deer will use it as a scrub or scrape, a scrape to get their velvet off their horns. You know, a bear might use it to scratch his back or to sharpen his claws. And the tree still stands. And God designed it like that with that outer dead bark to prevent that. So the living inner bark is composed of vascular phloem tissues, very similar to plants we studied in chapter 2, that will transport food from the leaves to the roots. A young stem does not have outer bark. Instead, the inner bark is protected by a protective, is covered by a protective epidermal layer of cells. And if you notice a tree really well, you can tell that the smallest branches are very bendable, easy to break, and that's because they've not had a chance to build up bark, but they do have a protective epidermal layer of cells. So each species of trees has its own unique bark. Some bark is rough with deep furrows and flakes. Others are smooth with just a few dimples. Recognizing the differences in the tree bark is an easy way to identify a specimen. And, you know, they give you a brain bite here that you might not have known. If you like cinnamon, it's basically coming from tree bark. Sometimes you can buy stuff that's called cinnamon bark, and it's basically where they have shaved just little pieces off of the cinnamon tree, you know, off the bark, and then you have to kind of grind it. But yeah, so if you like cinnamon, and I do, you're eating tree bark. So a ring of growth layers called the vascular cambium separates the bark layers from the woody tissues of the tree trunk. This layer produces wood and bark, increasing the diameter of the trunk, and this growth of a stem in diameter is called secondary growth. So basically, secondary growth is where the diameter is growing bigger, and you can see with each layer, it's maybe started out as a small branch, and then that secondary growth is it growing wider and wider. If I conk myself in the head with this, please do not make a weird TikTok or something weird with it. Okay, wood is the main tissue of the trunk, and wood consists of xylem tissue made of dead cells lined end to end in order to transport water, but not just water, also minerals, up to those leaves. Because xylem is fibrous, that makes wood tough, it makes it strong. And each year that the wood is produced by that vascular cambium, and it makes an annual growth ring. And most of y'all have probably learned that. The accumulation of those layers of wood gradually increases the diameter of the trunk, and that's why people will say, okay, we can kind of count and see how old this tree is. It's just, if you look at this, that's one reason why I really wanted you to look. They're really minuscule, the little rings are, so it's really hard to tell, to count that. I probably need this magnifying glass or something. Springwood is made of large xylem cells. It's a little lighter in color. Then you get summerwood that consists of small xylem cells, vessels, and it's darker because it's more closely compacted. So a layer of springwood and a layer of summerwood is produced in one annual growth ring. Generally, 1 year's growth is represented by one growth ring. And those variations in the color of the growth rings produces that grain that we see when wood is cut or made into furniture. And different woods have different grains. Something with a smooth grain, and one reason why it's very popular, except it's kind of naughty, is pine. But softer grain woods would be, or a smoother grain wood would be like maple, maybe cherry, and then rougher grain woods would be oak. It's hard as a rock, and it's got that rough grain in it, and you can't, even if you paint it, you can still see the grain through it. But that's just how God made different trees. The variations in the size of the vessels cause that different areas of wood to absorb wood stain differently and produce light and dark streaks. And so the grain is like, when they're that's why you can see some wood, you can, like maybe a maple, you could paint it and you wouldn't even see the grain. Whereas, like I said, oak, you paint it, you stain it, and you can really, really see the grain. The general core of a young woody stem is called the pith. So if you've got a young woody stem, and if you consider this a young woody stem, the pith would be the very, very center of it. The pith is used by those young stems to store the food, and then the pith becomes less useful as that tree ages and is not noticeable in an older tree. As a tree matures, the old layers of wood toward the center of that trunk die and become clogged with a gummy deposit. These deposits harden and darken the wood. This hard, inactive, dead wood is called heartwood and heartwood, that type of wood. And that wood is really, really popular for furniture, but not just furniture. You hear it being used a lot for wood flooring, heartwood flooring. It might say pine, heartwood, oak, heartwood, walnut, heartwood. That means they're taking that very inner part that's hard, it's been compressed, it's dead, and that's what they're using for flooring. It's really super expensive, more expensive because it's the inner part of it, it's not the whole thing. One reason why they use it is because the wood will not warp as much. So the functioning wood surrounding that dead heartwood is called the sapwood, and then the pith and the heartwood are sometimes missing in older trunks. Often they have to be eaten away by bacteria and fungi, leaving a hollow center. So the last little section that we're going to go over is basically stories from a tree stump. Of course, we live in an area of Tennessee that logging is a really big industry in our rural area. So there are probably some stumps or some logged trees that you could actually study. But if you're a forester and you're just trying to check out how this tree survived or what this tree's like, you probably don't want to cut trees down randomly to be able just to tell one thing, how old they are. So because studying a tree's annual growth tree can give insight to climate changes and past events, and scientists can then start to compare one tree with another older tree and create a timeline. The study of using tree rings from living trees or old lumber to reveal past events and determine a tree's age, where I'm on page 441, is dendro, meaning tree, chronology, meaning time. So it's tree time, tree time. So dendrochronology is useful only with trees in like our climate, which is a temperate climate. And if you're like, what's a temperate climate? We have 4 distinct seasons. We have deciduous trees that lose, deciduous hardwood trees that lose their leaves. In tropical climates, the trees grow year-round and they produce multiple rings annually, so you can't really study them. Simply counting the tree rings cannot accurately determine a tree's age, though. Sometimes annual rings are absent, or a ring may grow only in one section of the tree. Another limitation is the tree rings must show great variation in order to be recognized. If the rings are too similar, it's impossible to compare one tree sample to another. The rings will look identical, and they'll all match with every other ring. The best rings for dating are rings that show high degrees of annual variation with wide and thin bands throughout, and because of these irregularities, it's best to always cross-reference one tree, one oak, to another oak. So that means if you know all of this stuff, then you have to think, all right, now how many trees am I going to have to cut down to cross-reference? Well, studying trees, that's what this whole thing's about, doesn't require cutting down a tree. Scientists use an instrument that's called an increment borer, which you have a picture of on page 441. And it almost looks like, they're screwing something into a tree, but what it's actually doing is it's being screwed into a tree, but it's also cutting a sample of the bore, a sample of the bark, rather. That's, the trunk. It's cutting like a little peg that's going through there. An increment borer is a handheld drill that pushes a long metal straw through the tree, and when it's pulled out, the straw is filled with a complete sample with rings to study. Things like fire, insect, fungal attack, leaning, competition creates variation in those tree rings that can be used to determine events in a tree's life. And when a tree survives a fire, the fire burns away part of the trunk, leaving a visible scar tissue. The scars usually face the direction from which the fire spread. But when a tree grows on a slope or debris often accumulates on the upper side, that can also create a small, intense fire that will cause greater damage. By counting the rings from the bark to the scar, the scientists can then determine what year the fire occurred. Fallen trees, landslides, strong winds, other disturbances can also cause a tree to lean. And if you notice that the sample or the branch that I got, you can see that this is not perfectly centered. So this is an indication that it was leaning, or this branch was coming off at a lean, since it's not perfectly centered. So when a tree leans, its ring will grow on one side and form a distorted egg shape instead of circles. In conifer, this widening normally occurs in the side away from the ground, while in deciduous trees, it occurs on the side toward the ground. Stresses can cause thin ring productions, and two events cause stress in a tree's life. That could be competition, too many trees growing around it, or an actual attack. So competition is the struggle against other plants and trees for space, sunlight, water, and minerals. Competition occurs gradually over time as more and more trees and plants begin to fill in a forest. If the rings being studied shows a gradual decrease in width, this indicates that the tree developed competition as the forest grew. If the trees produce consistently wide rings, it signifies that that tree, and more than likely you can already look at it, is by itself in a field somewhere and had no competition. When a tree ring sample shows rings with an abrupt decrease in size, it represents an attack on the tree. So the sudden decrease in the ring width reveals that the tree's food manufacturing system, leaves, or its nutrient absorbing system, its roots, were somehow damaged. And it could show that that tree survived something. Yeah, it's windy, that's why everything is blinking here. It could survive a drought, pestilence, severe breakage from wind, or disease. So that ends today's lesson. Tomorrow we're going to start branching out. Yeah, that's the title of it. And we're going to start really talking about branches, buds, things like that. Then go over leaves. So for this next one, if you want to try to find this next lesson, if you want to try to take different kinds of leaves just from your yard or whatever's blowing, blowing around, I want to try to find a sassafras leaf because, well, actually we have pictures of it, but I can't find one because they're pretty wild looking. But have a good rest of the day. Hopefully you can get out there and experience trees, but not on today. It's like really super windy outside. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you with tomorrow's lesson. See ya.